No one expected that a simple hospice nurse would say something like this. After that interview, the entire internet started talking about her. Her words made people rethink everything we know about death. She claimed that a person sees what is hidden from the living. The nurse's name was Julie McFadden. She had worked for many years in a hospice, a place where those who can no longer be helped spend their final days. She had witnessed hundreds of deaths, and one day she decided to talk about what people usually stay silent about. "I don't want to shock anyone," she said, "but if my experience helps at least one person not to fear death, then it was all worth it." According to Julie, at the moment of death, something inexplicable happens to a person. It's as if an invisible veil rises, and the dying person sees another world, something we, the living, cannot see. She said, "In those seconds, a person seems to remember something they've always known. Their face becomes peaceful. They smile, and the fear disappears." Some people believe in life after death. Some do not. But for Julie, that question had been answered long ago. "I don't need to believe. I know for sure. Death is not the end." It was her work in hospice care that made her a witness to hundreds of such moments. One story changed her life forever. Her patient was younger than 30, an incurable disease. The last 6 months, in the hospice. Young, strong, angry at fate. He couldn't accept that everything was over. Friends rarely visited, relatives even less often. Julie often came to see him just to talk. At first he was distant, then he began to trust her. They talked for hours, about life, about loss, about fear. The main question that tormented him was, what comes next? What happens when the heart stops? Julie didn't know how to answer, but everything changed that night. On the day of his death, Julie wasn't in the hospice. She was driving on personal errands when she suddenly felt uneasy. Something pricked her heart, as if someone was calling her name. And at that very moment, she heard a voice. Quiet. Male. The same voice as her patient's. "If only I had known that death was like this, I wouldn't have been afraid of it." Julie turned sharply. There was no one in the car. Only the radio was silent, and a chill ran down her skin. A minute later, the phone rang. The duty nurse said the young man had died. Julie froze. Now she knew. That voice was real. He had thanked her for her care and sent his final message from beyond life. After that day, she was never the same again. She admitted, "That was the first time I realized death doesn't destroy the bond between us. It simply moves it into another dimension." After that incident, Julie McFadden began to observe the dying more closely. She wanted to understand what really happens at the moment of departure. Years of observation allowed her to identify several signs that indicate a person is standing on the threshold of death. She called them the deathbed phenomena. The first thing she noticed, people become softer, more sentimental. They want everyone they love to be near. They suddenly start talking about forgiveness, Julie said, about childhood, about their parents, about what they've missed, and it's as if they're waiting for someone to hold their hand. But it's not only people who sense the approach of the end. Animals, especially dogs, notice it first. Julie recalled how patients' pets would suddenly start acting strange, restless, whining, lying by the bed, refusing to leave their owner even for a minute. "They seem to know their person is about to go," she said, "and they want to stay until the very end." Gradually, Julie began to notice recurring patterns. Every time, the same signs. Every time, the same feeling of silence before something great. These observations made me believe that death is not a full stop, but a transition, she confessed. According to her, death does not end existence. It simply opens another door. One of the most remarkable signs was a sudden burst of energy. She called it the final surge. Even severely ill patients, those who hadn't gotten out of bed for weeks, would suddenly come alive. They asked for food. They joked. They talked about the future as if they were going to live much longer. But this surge never lasted long. A few hours, sometimes a day. After that came the silence. "I always warn families," Julie said. "Don't be deceived. This isn't recovery. It's a farewell. The soul is preparing to leave." Sometimes it happened quietly, sometimes with astonishing clarity. People began to see what others could not. They looked into an empty corner of the room and smiled. They spoke to someone who was no longer there. They reached their hands upward, as if greeting an unseen guest. One of my patients once raised her arms and said, "I'm opening the doors to heaven." That's when I realized they were already waiting for her. Julie called these phenomena the deathbed gaze and the deathbed reach. That's how the transition began. There were other cases, even stranger ones. Some patients knew in advance when they would die. "Tonight I'll go," they said calmly, without fear. "I can feel it." And almost always, it happened exactly that way. Some waited until their children arrived. Others, on the contrary, waited for everyone to leave the room. And a few held on until a special date, a wedding, a birthday, an important event. "After years of observation, I've realized one thing," Julie wrote. "The closer a person is to death, the less fear they have. Everything becomes simple. It's as if they already know where they're going." These words became her main message. "The more dying people I saw, the less I feared my own end." Julie McFadden was not the only one who spoke about such phenomena. It turned out that doctors and nurses all over the world noticed the same things. Dr. David Kessler worked for many years in hospices. He had witnessed thousands of final moments. And he said, "If there is nothing beyond our world, then why do the dying tell us the opposite? Why do they see those who died before them and say they are not afraid?" These words were spoken at a palliative care conference, and they became legendary. David Kessler was a student of the famous psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the woman who dedicated her life to studying death and dying. She was the one who introduced the concept of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Together they worked with dying patients. They listened to their stories, they recorded every detail. After Elizabeth's death, Kessler published a book containing dozens of real testimonies. These were the words of people who stood on the threshold between two worlds. "My first case, one I will never forget," Kessler said, "was connected to a woman named Dora. She was dying of a severe illness. She would lose consciousness and then come back to it again. One day she opened her eyes and began talking to someone no one else could see. Her voice was soft, as if she was speaking to a loved one. 'Mom, you came. What a bright light you are,' she whispered. Everyone around froze. The air seemed to grow thicker. There was silence in the room, but a presence could be felt." Later, Kessler wrote, "I can't explain it scientifically, but it seems natural to me that, at the end of the journey, we are met by those who love us the most." He admitted that he wasn't a religious man, but after dozens of such cases, he stopped doubting. This was not hallucination. It was part of the transition. On another occasion, he observed an elderly woman talking to her deceased husband. At first, her relatives thought it was caused by medication. They asked the doctors to stop the drugs, but even after that, she kept talking to him, calmly, clearly, with a smile. "He's here," she said. "He's waiting for me." A day later, she died, as quietly as a child falling asleep. Kessler recalled, "In all my years, I have never heard anyone say, 'Nothing is happening. I'm going into nothingness.' On the contrary, the dying always said, 'They came. I see the light. I'm not afraid.' And I decided I'd rather believe the words of those who have seen it with their own eyes than the doubts of the living who have never stood at that edge." These confessions shocked the medical community. Doctors rarely speak about such things openly. They fear ridicule, fear being seen as irrational. But in recent years, more and more professionals have admitted, at the moment of death, a person doesn't fade, they awaken. And the more Julie read the stories of Kessler and Kubler-Ross, the more she understood. They were all talking about the same thing: a world that waits for us beyond fear. "Death doesn't take," she wrote, "it returns us to where we came from." Barbara Karnes worked in hospice care for more than 30 years. She saw death every day, but the longer she observed it, the less she believed in its finality. Death equalizes everyone, she said. Before it doesn't matter who you are, a worker or a politician. In those moments, everyone is equally vulnerable. Everyone is just human. She kept journals, recording everything that happened in the final hours of her patients' lives. That's how her handbook was born, one of the most cited works in the world of hospice medicine. Barbara noticed that fear almost always disappears right before death. Even those who had been panicking for weeks became calm just a few days before passing. It's as if someone helps them from the inside, she wrote, as though an invisible guide appears beside them. Most often, the dying saw those who had gone before them, their parents, siblings, children, sometimes entire groups of loved ones. They're standing by the bed, patients would say, and they're waiting. One of the most powerful cases stayed with her for many years, a young woman dying of cancer. Her last night she couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, calling out for her mother. At dawn, she suddenly went quiet. She opened her eyes. She looked toward a corner of the room where no one was standing, and she smiled. "Mom, I'm so happy to see you." A few minutes later she died, peacefully, without pain, as if she had simply gone home. In another case, the guide was a father. The patient was 52. She was terrified of dying, saying she would fight for her life until the very last second. But 2 days before her death, she began staring through the walls, as if speaking to someone unseen. "Who are you talking to?" Barbara asked. "To my dad," the woman replied. "He says everything's okay." Just before she passed, she said softly, "I'm not afraid anymore." Barbara admitted, "I can't explain it scientifically, but I was there. I saw it. I felt how the air around us changed. It's impossible to describe in words, as if a door opens and something light enters through it." Over the years, she collected hundreds of such stories, and they all told the same thing. The dying are met by someone. Most often it's the mother, Barbara wrote, and that seems logical. She brought us into this world, and she helps us leave it. There were cases when patients spoke about light, dazzling but warm, sometimes about music, like the sound of a distant choir, sometimes about places filled with breathtaking beauty. One patient looked up and whispered, "Do you see those lights? They're calling me." A minute later, her heart stopped. Another smiled and said, "I hear singing, it's so beautiful, and I feel wings." When Barbara looked at such people, she knew the moment was near, but it wasn't frightening. It was calm. "When a person sees the light," she said, "I understand, and they're no longer in pain. They're already being welcomed." Another patient once told her, "Barbara, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for everything. But now I'm going home. There's light. There are clouds." That same day he died, with a gentle smile on his face. "All these cases strengthened my faith," Barbara wrote. "I can't prove that there is life after death. But I know for sure death is not random. It's planned, and there is no cruelty in it. It's simply a return home." Julie McFadden often said that death is not an enemy. It's a transition, a moment when a person stops being afraid and simply goes where they've already been. "When the dying see the light," she wrote, "it's not a hallucination, it's a return. We recognize the place we once knew but long forgot." Barbara Karnes called death a second birth. The first time, our mother brings us into the world. The second, someone we've loved. It's a natural process. We're only afraid of it because we can't see what's on the other side. She believed that everything we call the end is, in truth, a beginning. David Kessler spoke differently, but the meaning was the same. "Death doesn't take love away," he said. "It releases it. I've seen hundreds of people smile in their final moments, not because it was easy, but because they saw that love never disappears." And all three, Julie, Barbara, and Kessler, came to the same conclusion. Fear fades where understanding begins. When we see death not as a break, but as a return, everything becomes quieter, lighter, warmer. "I'm not afraid anymore," Julie said. "When my time comes, if someone comes for me, I'll simply say, 'Thank you for meeting me.' She said that after all her years in hospice, she began to live differently, slower, deeper. She stopped postponing words of love. She looked people in the eyes more often, and she always held the hands of those who were afraid. I realized, she said, that all we truly have is love. It begins here and continues there, and no one can take it away. Death no longer seemed like darkness to her. On the contrary, it was light. The same light her patients spoke of, the one that calls but doesn't frighten. I think, she said in one interview, that when we die, we simply wake up. We wake up where everything begins again. The world still argues about whether there's life after death. Scientists search for proof. Skeptics demand facts. But those who've been beside the dying say something else. Sometimes, Barbara Karnes wrote, you don't need proof to believe. You just need to be there, to see someone go peacefully with a smile and understand. It's not the end. It's a return home. Maybe the truth is simple. Maybe everything we call death is just a door. And on the other side of that door, they're already waiting for us, with the same voices, the same laughter, the same warmth that never disappeared. I don't know what's waiting for me there, Julie said. But if death is even a little like what I've seen, then there's nothing to be afraid of. Death is not the end of the story, it's the page that turns, and maybe that's where the real story begins.